जावा सच गोरिए नी तेरे तेरे तो पता सेवा.
Highly successful in the UK, Debating Matters challenges 16 to 18-year-olds to engage in high-level debate about contemporary society. A unique feature of the competition is that students engage in debate with a panel of high-achieving professionals on topics as diverse as drug trials, free speech and terrorism.
This is the first ever national final for Debating Matters India, so all of us who are here today are in a way making history. I'm Claire Fox and I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas in the UK that initiated Debating Matters, and sitting next to me is my colleague Tony Gilland, who runs the competition in the UK. So Debating Matters is about substance, not style. It's about emphasising content. And it's about real life debates as they affect us in terms of current affairs and the important issues of the day.
The debate for this semi-final is: clinical trials in India exploit the poor and vulnerable. Arguing for the motion on my left is Don Bosco School from Kolkata. Arguing against the motion on my right is Sri Shankara School from Chennai. Welcome to both teams. It's going to be a great debate. So, can we give them a big round of applause to encourage them?
The motion for today's debate reads: clinical trials in India exploit the poor and the vulnerable. Before arguing in favor of the motion, I'd like to make our stance very clear by saying that clinical trials and research are not wrong in themselves. It is unethical and illegal miscarriage of these trials that exploit the poor and the vulnerable. We stand against this exploitation. Until 1995, the clinical trials have been mainly conducted in the USA, Europe, and Japan. But in the era of globalization, drug companies have been steadily outsourcing their research enterprises to the developing world. The recent rules and laws framed in our country do encourage clinical trials to a great extent. But the greatest concern about clinical trials in India, from the vantage point of both Indians and ethicists, is illegal and unethical trials. A number of these have attracted adverse coverage in the media in recent years. In 2002, two new chemical entities called M4N and G4N that had been discovered in the United States were tested in 26 patients with oral cancer. In the same year, self-styled researchers working in their own clinics formulated vaginal pellets of erythromycin and tried them as contraceptive agents in more than 790 poor, illiterate and rural women in West Bengal. In 2003, letrozole, an anti-cancer drug, was tested in more than 430 young women at a dozen private clinics to find out whether it promoted ovulation. All these trials took place without regulatory approval. The ICMR, Indian Council of Medical Research, has no authority to stop clinical trials approved by the IECs, the international ethical communities. But the saddest part of it is that many IECs are biased and they're used as weapons by foreign pharmaceutical companies to conduct clinical trials in India. Clinical trials on poor people are often justified on grounds of wider interests of the society. But is it justifiable? Is it really justifiable that we create two societies, one for testing the drugs and others for benefiting from them? I raise my case.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pramit. Well done.
Is it really unethical or is it perceived so? I would justifiably think it's the latter. It's true, because if there hadn't been any clinical trial, then there would not have been any medical development. Coming to the present scenario, I would strongly say clinical trials do not exploit the poor and the vulnerable. In fact, the patients are more safer in the clinical trials because careful observations are made on safety and efficacy. Secondly, we do have a host of controls monitoring these clinical trials, and some of them are DCGI, the Ethics Board, CTRI, Central Drug Standard Control Organization, and the DDAB. Just like right soldiers make a strong army, right patients determine the success of a clinical trial. The patient who is recruited for a clinical trial is told about the adverse drug reactions. A document with proper references is vetted by the FDA before it is released for test marketing. Just because the majority of the people who undergo the clinical trials are the poor, there's a general accusation that they are unduly exploited. But that's not the fact. In fact, they benefited. The social awareness about the ethics and the principles gets enhanced in the society. The patients are exposed to advanced technology. Some patients have no alternatives for treatment and permanent debilitation or deaths are imminent. In such cases, clinical trials do help. India has got quite a few internationally reputed drug companies, and some of them are Ranbaxy, Shanti's Biotech, Reddy's Lab, etc. And once, Ranbaxy developed a drug for HIV at a very competitive cost, and the clinical trials were conducted in India only. This drug, after a tough fight with the US agencies, has been patented in the USA also. Yes, we have been doing clinical trials all along, but why should all of a sudden this should become a major issue? This is because of certain misconceptions and pessimistic views that any development activity would receive. As long as the development activities are taking place, there would be violations. If there is no certain computers in India, there's Enron in USA. Reputation is also important. India is a pluralistic democracy with an inquisitive media and a strong civil society. It is therefore not worth the reputation risk for companies to engage in exploitative practices. The Indian government, the Indian doctors, and indeed the patients are broadly welcoming the practice because they're able to see its economic and medical benefits. And let's hope that a vocal minority like this is not able to derail the most positive of the developments. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Very good morning to all present here. Today we live in a world where, in the name of clinical trials, private companies are exploiting the poor and the vulnerable section of our society. We all understand that clinical trials are indeed essential for the progress of medical science, but we can never justify the unethical and dishonest clinical trials that take place in India. Without actually intending to do so, policymakers in India have allowed participation in clinical trials to become something very close to a job. Payment methods subjects are often referred to as compensations, to suggest that they are merely reimbursing the patients for the expense and inconvenience, even though many interviews show that these participants use the money from the trial to meet their ends. They refer to the paid subjects as volunteers, implying that the participants are free to decide whether or not to take part in the trial itself. But this is a complete misconception because people have valiantly stated that they have taken up clinical trials only for the money's sake. Regulators allow sponsors to use money to attract subjects, but these subjects do not get whatever they want. And money is paid to the people not to do something, but just to endure the pain. And often they are not reimbursed properly for the pain that they have taken. Before taking part in the clinical trial, the participants must sign on consent letter. It's basically an instrument to protect the sponsors, researchers, medical officers, and in short, everyone else apart from the patient himself. Moreover, the consent letter is drafted in very complex and convoluted English and translated very poorly into 23 regional languages. Thus, we can conclude that consent letters are completely unintelligible to the participants, and thus these participants, which include the poor and the vulnerable section of society, cannot make correct use of the consent letter. Therefore, the purpose of consent letter is totally void in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, anyway. Well done.
Abraham Lincoln once quoted, "The fiery trials through which we pass will let us decide the honor or dishonor of a future generation." But how do we protect our future generation from the threat-posing epidemics and pandemics? Good morning. Do clinical trials really affect the weak and vulnerable? The answer is no, absolutely not. First of all, what is a clinical trial? It is an experiment designed to answer the investigative study of a doctor, a scientist, with the consent of the individual and also the DCGI. In this rapidly developing era, India is emerging as a hub for clinical trials. An enriched pool of highly qualified and skilled medical professionals suited for research and development, a large ground for different races and a blend of different ethnic people and populace make India a perfect ground for clinical trials. India has promised a computer-based technology evolution of a virtual man on which medicines and drugs will be tested before it is tested on people. This is set to be put in force by the year 2020. Now, why is it we come across a few people who claim that clinical trials affect the weak and vulnerable? It is sure painful to see that people being close-minded and too critical. While each day, hundreds and thousands of people are saved because of the drugs they consume, all thanks to clinical trials. Do you think many of us would have even existed if not for the smallpox vaccine, which obviously had to undergo a lot of clinical trials before coming into the market? No. So why do I hear allegations made about it? For instance, there is a silly misconception that clinical trials exploit the poor. Oh, so you're telling me that in India, the poor people work their wages off in thousands by surrendering themselves to the scientists as a study material? Let's talk practicality here. This is impossible. First thing to remember is that no money whatsoever or compensation will be given to the patient who undergoes the clinical trials. That is considered a criminal offense, and the company or researcher held responsible will have to deal with the code. And this is overviewed by the DCGI because they alone have the power to permit the sponsor to carry out his or her trials. So why indulge into protest against clinical trials when there are other important issues like exploitation of civil rights and war on terrorism? Let's face it, nothing ventured, nothing gained. A fitting example would be research on trials on bone marrow stem cells, which are taken from healthy people. These trials contributed a significant portion to the clinical department by curing stroke, spinal cord injury, myocardial infarction, etc. only in India. So why go on biased views, make allegations that will retard our country's progress? I rest my case.
Thank you. Well done.
I'd like to ask Don Bosco if either of the debaters have read an informed consent letter.
Yes, the examples you gave of trials which had posed concerns were from several years ago, actually before the major change in the regulation, the upgrading of the regulator, and the acceleration of trials both as international companies come here, but also as Indian companies like Dr. Reddy's and Ranbaxy who are doing their own research and doing trials. So you have some historic examples, but don't you think things have improved in the last 2 or 3 years? And are there any recent examples that would support your objections?
As for the examples of that we have put up being old and outdated and not in accordance to the modern development, I'd like to give some more examples which are from the year 2003. That's quite recent. So it's that letrozole trials in India conducted by Sun Pharmaceuticals, there were certain violations, like the informed consent was not obtained at all. Secondly, the streptokinase trials conducted by Santa Biotechnics and Biocon in 2003 again had the same problem where some of the subjects were not informed at all that they were going for a trial. Then again in 2003, by unclear, and probably the period is really unclear, but the year is 2003, the drug was risperidone, and the treatment was for acute mania, and it was conducted by Johnson & Johnson. Again, the informed consent was not properly obtained from all participants. So we clearly see that the utilization of what the informed consent is for is clearly being avoided by some of the companies so as to fast up the process of releasing their drug into the market.
Today, the companies, the pharmaceutical companies mainly, are keen to cut down on drug development costs and the time spent in obtaining regulatory approval. And in this pursuit of theirs, they do undermine a lot of security issues and a lot of issues which really concern us.
Please be clear about these things. You have to differentiate unethical from illegal trials. Now, if somebody is doing a trial without taking permission from DCGI, without taking permission from authorities, he is doing an illegal act, and that becomes a criminal offense. It's for the police to deal with it, and police will deal with it. That aspect should not be blamed on the scenario of clinical trials in India. The case of letrozole is exactly the case I'm referring to. Letrozole trial was conducted, as well as the trial in Trivandrum, I'm very well aware of that trial, was carried out without taking permission of DCGI. And the debate here is not about that. The debate about is that if you take permission from DCGI and then do a misconduct, don't do the trial properly or exploit the poor, that is what the debate is about. The debate is not about illegal trials that are carried out by individuals without proper permissions. That's a different scenario altogether. I think you must make that distinction.
I mean, a majority, as the opposition rightly pointed out, a majority of people who undergo clinical trials are poor. And in this case, there is no scenario where we find that the foreign outsourcing of trials to India, the foreign companies develop drugs there, and then the phase 3 trials, etc., are done in India. And later, what these people who have undergone the trials find, when they actually require the drug, in case of a disease they are suffering from, they are unable to afford it. Aren't we splitting the society up, setting them apart for testing and exploitation, and then, the more affluent society makes use of it?
New products are nearly always only available in small quantities and at high cost when they're first developed. Normally, there's then a life cycle of those products that over 5, 10, 15, 20 years, after which they're generic, and everybody can benefit. And indeed, India is the world leader in the manufacture of generic drugs once they come off patent. So this is just a natural part of the process, and actually what we're saying here is that India can benefit both at the beginning of the process by giving some patients access to drugs early in clinical trials, and then at the end of their life, India will create its generic drug companies and exploit them to the rest of the world. So isn't this just a matter of timing?
I would give a small example regarding the drugs that are used to safeguard a person from future effects of HIV or AIDS. The drugs that are being used now, they are first tested on Africans. It's a long time back, and even today the Africans cannot afford it. So we cannot always say that over a period of time it will become accessible, even in India, because we're considering a vast majority of the population who very slowly tend to develop. We are the minority population is developing at a fast pace. The majority is not. So we don't expect the poorer section of a society to suddenly jump up and get access to this high, not very cost-effective, but high-cost drugs, which they have helped to ensure that other people get access to. So it's not always a question that it's really a question. What he puts it that sometimes the poor and vulnerable become the guinea pigs for tests, and the rich and the influential people utilize the benefits.
I apologize to Dr. Jack for missing out the question. To be honest, we haven't read a consent letter. We haven't, and but it is but truth that the consent letter is highly technical. We'd probably need a combination of a lawyer and a highly qualified doctor in order to evaluate that.
I've written lots of consent letters. Consent letters are designed to an educational age of 10. The point is, and I think it's terribly important, that you don't equate illiteracy and poverty with stupidity. It is the duty of care of the person who is running the clinical trial to explain to the subject. And in the case of something like risperidone, which we were talking about, which is for mania, it may not be that the patient themselves is capable of giving the consent, in which case there are very clear provisions for a representative, for a parent, for a family member to give that.
There's one more point I wanted to clarify was about giving permission to foreign drug companies to do phase 2, phase 3 studies here in India. The law clearly states that the company that is doing the trials in India must be doing trials in the country of the origin where the company is based. Otherwise, the drugs controller does not permit the trials to be carried out. So it is not that the company is based in US and they're doing trials only in India. They have to do trials in their own country. Then only the DCGI gives permission. That's a very important point.
We accept that people are not stupid. The people can understand what is right and wrong and take a correct decision. But if you don't know the facts correct, your right decision may be a wrong choice. If I tell someone that you come to this trial and if something goes wrong, you can get a minor and use a big medical term which he does not understand. And since I am a very busy person, I do not waste my time explaining this person who will be just one individual out of 2,000 participating in a trial. So I don't want to waste my time over there. Okay. So what happens is that this person does not understand the medical term, and he says, okay, I never heard the term before, maybe it's nothing great serious. So he says, accepts it. He accepts it. In that form, what goes wrong is that we're not questioning the rationality of a person. We're just questioning the access to knowledge of a person.
You correctly pointed out that the people can take the help of others in evaluating. If they're illiterate, if they do not understand, they can take the help of others. But in India, there are many pressing issues that we're facing today. The moment we take the help of others, the moment we go about seeking help of qualified people, a big issue of corruption creeps in.
Girls, you made your case very strongly, but I'd like to place a sort of general ethical question to you. Aren't there some areas where we should just be intolerant of any violations? Aren't there some areas which are too sensitive to allow, any level of violations, and isn't this one of them?
I think they made very good points on their side of the argument, but they forgot a few things. The argument that there is a high illiteracy in India, the knowledge of general public is poor, that they have ignored completely. And the bigger point is that the regulatory oversight in India at various places in the country is poor, and all the institutions are not at the same level. You find areas in India, hospitals in India, which have very low standards or poor standards, whereas there are good hospitals in India which have standards as best as the West. I think that point you have ignored, and you should have pointed out that the trials need closer supervision, and there should be careful selection of centers and physicians and investigators who are carrying out these studies.
You talked about the fact that there had been a development of a clinical drug here in India for HIV. Do you see the expansion of clinical trial activity in India being not just for India, but for the rest of the world? Initiating in India rather than it initiating in the rest of the world and coming to India, but India actually starting to become a genesis of clinical activity for the rest of the world.
As far as what I've read, I came to know that India is going to launch the phase 1 in our country soon enough. In matter of maximum 1 or 2 years, it will be launched in India. And that is a booster for our medical trials. Because of that, foreign medicines can be tested in our country, and medicines generated in our country can be tested all over the world. That really is expansion.
There are currently trials taking place in the areas ranging from neurology to endocrinology, and India basically focuses on infectious disease and oncology. So it's like as more and more drugs come onto the market, competition between the therapies will bring down the cost, and it is like foreign exchange. So we improve that, and just because phase 1 is not being conducted, that doesn't mean that we don't have expansion of clinical trials in India. Since we are a developing country, we're still developing. We're struggling developing country, so we have to improve on that instead of curbing all these activities, telling that we are exploiting the poor, we're exploiting this section of people, we're exploiting them. So we need measures to develop it rather than curbing them. That's what I'm trying to say.
Some of you people could have really exploited the situation that phase 1 trials are not permitted in India. This is a safety for Indian patients, and nobody used that point to their advantage. It's a safety that is in the system for Indian patients, so they are not exploited, simply because phase 1 trials are more risky, they're more dangerous. So that point nobody has made. I think that point should have been clearly made here. A lot of you have have pointed to the fact that trials benefit patients. Now, if you're talking of randomized trials, that is phase 3 trials, and since there is an element of randomization, half of the patients won't get this study or won't get that drug. So we never do trials or a particular trial just to benefit that group of patients. We're testing a hypothesis, we're testing a drug. And if you're already biased that it is benefiting the patient, that means you should not be doing a study, you should not be doing a trial. So when you start a trial, you should be unbiased and not for the benefit of patients. That trial could benefit future patients on a larger scale, but not necessarily that group of patients. So that is not the intention of doing a phase 3 study. That argument cannot be held.
So we do know that if we come across any exploitation, it is criminally, it's a criminal offense. We can file a case against that particular researcher or organization itself.
And to add upon that point, we have RTI where you can write to them and know what has happened in the trial, and so the company must comply to that, and they must reply to them properly about what the trial is, whether they were exploited, whether they have given the consent, the patients have signed the proper consent, what the doctors have done. And in case if norms and procedures are not proper or they are not followed, then you can file a case. You have every right to do that. So this no matter of exploitation, because not everyone can come into a clinical trial, because before a clinical trial there are many procedures to be followed, like they take your age, BMI, your weight, and everything. So, just because you catch a person from the road and put him in a clinical trial doesn't mean he should be a part of clinical trial. He should be capable for that.
Yeah, when you were presenting, right, you made the strong case that India is not only has got a new drug regulator, which it does, and that you had trust in them, but that you had an inquiring media and you had a democracy which increased the levels of liability for companies that did wrong things. But you went on to say that some level of wrongdoing was inevitable, but that was okay because it would be found out. And I'm just saying, why do you think it's acceptable that any level of wrongdoing is acceptable for clinical trials?
What I tried to say in my speech was, since it's a development activity, it would have some disadvantages and some advantages. So, just because there are disadvantages, we should not stop them. And thing is, what I'm trying to say is, everywhere there is corruption, there is violation. So that doesn't mean we are not going to do something. So what I tried to say was, in a clinical trial, it's very risky. So it's getting an informed consent, telling them you might die, or you might have adverse drug reactions, or you might be benefited. So it's a very tough situation for the patient to decide whether he should participate in a trial. But thing is, we need to move on with the change. We need to look up for issues for which we need to find solutions, so that we can improve our society, we can improve our government, we can improve our country and bring them to greater standards. So just because there are few violations doesn't mean that we need to stop clinical trials and get over the other issues.
You said people who are illiterate, they can't understand the pros and cons of this clinical trials and are victims of clinical trials and being exploited. That is why we have a witness who's not related to either the research foundation or the patient. They have to submit a witness statement, and this is done under the concern and the overview of the DCGI, and the DCGI, the sponsors, whoever want to operate this clinical trial, submit a bunch of papers on the clinical trial, the effects, the possible effects, and also the procedure to the DCGI, who give permission for them to conduct the clinical trial. Then the ethic board, if the hospital has an ethic board, they have to give their consent. If the hospital does not have an ethic board, if it does not have an institutional ethic board, then they have to approach a private ethic board and get their consent before anything is done. So technically what is going on is that these illiterate people do know what is happening to them. Though they may not know the technicalities, they know whether it will cause harm to them or not. They are doing it voluntarily and they are not forced into it.
Do you believe that any degree of unscrupulousness that you're talking about is consistent with sustainable commercial success?
If we thought about commercial success, we wouldn't have had a drug to cure smallpox or chickenpox or any of this. Smallpox has been eradicated from the whole country only because of clinical trials. Obviously, it had to go through many phases before giving the drugs. So everything has to undergo a procedure, and it is not about commercialization. It is more based on the intention that the government has to do something for the people.
In your speech, you mentioned the patients have compensation. I think you've totally misinterpreted the fact they don't have any compensation. Instead, they're insured. The sponsors give them insurance. And the other thing is Shanti Biotechnics, they got the permission of the DCGI. There were 6 people who died in that, and the DCGI finally informed the GEAC that the accepted range of mortality rate is 6%. And even this was published in the Economic Times. And you have to give your justification because you've totally misrepresented the facts.
I'd like to point out one thing of my speech that you have missed totally. I have never questioned the existence, we have never questioned the existence of clinical trials. Clinical trials they're very important for the advancement of medicine and science. It's definitely true. But what we lack today is ethics in clinical trials. Their miscarriage is what worries us.
Okay, so you pointed out a few cases. In those cases, the companies had not got the permission of the DCGI, and so how do you call them a clinical trial? They're a punishable offense.
Out of the 3 examples that I read out, there was not all the cases lacked the permission from the DCGI. What I talked about was that certain norms of the trials were overlooked, as the participants were not clearly informed about what they were going to undergo. And if you are drafted into the trial without knowing what you're going to do, that's an ethical question you're posing up.
You're telling that they didn't, okay, some of them got the permission of DCGI, but the ethics were not properly followed. But in all the cases, the ethics were properly followed. There was informed consent. Though they were illiterates, they were told about that. The thing is, if you actually believe the media has just exaggerated the case, I should say. Even in this Shanti Biotechnics case, the AIMS case, and many others, they just exaggerated the case. And even if you believe the media in sense, then they've also published the report that the Shanti Biotechnics, what they did was not wrong.
Following up on what she said, the cases that you pointed out and few other cases, the companies which have, which have conducted the clinical trials will have to be prosecuted, brought into court if they have done it. And the media obviously loves feed. They like to blow up every single news that they get. And you can see that each and every case is blown out of proportion as long as we derive the information from the media. So how do you justify it? How do you say, do you have any proof to show which companies these are, and do you know when this happened, and can you give me instances where they have confessed it or they have been arrested or brought into court?
Well, you have just pointed out that we cannot believe in the media. The media is it lays overemphasis and it exaggerates, right? But if I'm not wrong, and I'm quite sure about it, that in your opening speeches, you had said that it is the media. I mean, in India, we have a free media, which will check. You had asked for examples, okay? A very eminent example. Risperidone trials in India, conducted by Johnson & Johnson in 2003, Gujarat, India. Unethical aspects of it. During a trial for the treatment of acute mania, psychiatric patients were taken off their existing medication and told that it was discontinued and no longer available. They subsequently received risperidone or a placebo. This was controversial because the patients receiving placebo could suffer unnecessary harm by being taken off their medication. One patient explained that he signed a form because the doctor required it, but had no idea that he was participating in a clinical trial. How do you justify this?
Look, media should be responsible. What we're talking is, we believe the media, we watch the television, and we talk about those issues. So media should have been responsible about giving them the facts. They should have waited till the facts are out. Instance, you take this AIMS case, 42 babies died. But the thing is, the ones who died, only half of them were given the drugs and half of them were not. They just exaggerated. They didn't give the proper fact. They just told 42 babies died because of the clinical trial. So the thing is, they should give the news, but they should wait till they get the right news, because people believe the media, and media plays a strong role in this.
The basic fact remains that half of the babies died. Well, arguing for clinical trials and saying that they're completely ethical at this point of time in India, you'd like to support their expansion too, right? And in case they expand, the number of trials being conducted is going to increase drastically. How do you expect the media? You had laid emphasis on the media keeping a check. How do you expect the media to keep a check on all of these trials? And you said that we can file a case. The people undergoing the trial can file a case against them if necessary. How can you expect these people, the minorities, the weaker sections of the society, to put voices up against large companies like Johnson & Johnson?
My question pertains to your speech where you mentioned something about a virtual man by the year 2020. So you are saying that by 2020 it would be first a virtual man, then a real man. So it would be safer to do so. So you are going to wait till 2020 to actually do the right thing and let unethics rule the world for then on.
It's seen, I've just heard from a few doctors I know, that during clinical trials, the patients who are undergoing clinical trial are given extremely attentive care, VIP treatment. Each and every change in their health is monitored. So it's been observed in many cases that the overall health of the patients who are undergoing clinical trial improves, irrespective of whether they're given placebo or the drug itself. So isn't that against exploitation? Because the people who won't receive any care whatsoever from their family members or with the economic status that they have, when they are given this attentive sort of care that they get in clinical trials, how is that exploitation?
Pharmaceutical companies agree they complete all the legal formalities, but why are only the poor people considered as test subjects? Why not the upper class? Why not the rich?
let's be practical here. Let's talk practicality. We're talking about a country that is India. India, where thousands of people do not even have access to doctors, and where even if they do have, a lot of the rural population consider the word of the doctor of the word of the God. What they say is, all right, that's beneficial for us. So, our country is even full of cases wherein unintentionally doctors have made mistakes. So how can you stress on the fact that even if they do not have any selfish motive, if the pharmaceutical companies do not have the motive of selling their products, can make mistakes, and how can we endanger the lives of people for that?
My question is that mostly all the clinical trials are conducted for mostly with rural people. Is it just because of their illiteracy and backwardness? And if they undergo any of the any consequences of those clinical trials, then who's responsible for that?
Well, as regards to the case of extremely attentive treatment given to the people undergoing clinical trials, I would say that is not an advantage. Do we need to rely on clinical trials for getting medication? Doesn't the government and the society have the responsibility of giving it to the poor people?
I would like to first answer the question which pertain to the fact whom should we blame for these unethical actions that are going on. The answer is very simple and very vast as well. It includes the lack of infrastructure that we put into clinical trials in India. People are unaware how they are being carried out, what is being done. Only they know that it is being done to them. The lack of awareness, and here where we consider the positive role of the media plays an important role to make the people know what they are undergoing, how they may be detrimental or advantageous to them, so that these people do not make a blind choice, rather a wise choice. Okay, we are happy that he gets attentive care during the medication period, but what happens when the trials are done? When these people are left stranded again without any medical treatment? A long period of medical treatment followed by a lapse in medical treatment would worsen the situation moreover. And then again, another question pertained, what are the regulations and rights that are being infringed upon in this modern unethical treatments? The thing is that every person has the right to correct information. In most cases that we see where things go wrong, our people are not correctly informed due to negligency, and in very rare cases due to purposeful attitude of the people involved. So we can clearly cite this as an area where advantages have been taken by big companies in order to get their job done faster.
It's really a big challenge in front of us, how to make clinical trials ethical and make the society and science progress. It is all about awareness. We have to be aware. We as the rich and affluent section, the more educated section of the society, we have the responsibility of informing, of making the weaker sections of the society aware. And also, in case they're violated, we take steps.
You said if a drug is put to clinical trial, then why do the doctors have to tell us what is the side effect? Basically, the whole intention of trying a drug on a person is to know whether the drug can cure the disease or not. And side effects have been they can predict the side effects because they know what elements they use in their drug.
Just to add on that point, the doctors or the ones who sponsor the drug companies, they submit papers bringing out the facts about what would be the advantages, what would be the disadvantages, how the drug would be effective, how you can make it effective, and so things like that, they're actually gone through with the DCGI, and then only they come for test marketing.
Okay, one more question about testing of trials of drugs which have steroid and all that. It's the basic fundamental rule that no doctors, no researchers, no scientists use drugs for trial on people which are toxic, carcinogenic or cytogenic. That is the basic rule. That is the baseline of any clinical trial.
To answer for the question of illiteracy and why only poor people go for clinical trials, thing is, it's not like it's not only poor people who go for clinical trials, it's like poor people cannot afford for treatment. So when they go, and they're terminally ill, so death are the ultimate result when the situation is like that. So there are lights of hope that they might be treated by the drug. So in case you take a cancer and they go in for a clinical trial, they get free chemotherapy. So it's like that. So when you take the higher classes can afford for that, while the poor people cannot afford. It's not like the higher classes do not participate, because in places like USA, all these students who study in Harvard and Princeton universities, they participate in clinical trial as a part-time job. So in India, it doesn't happen. It's basically the view of the person. If you want, you can participate, because it's up to you. It's voluntary.
You said that no drug is tested on people if it's toxic. Well, I have to say to you that everything is toxic. Toxic simply means that at a high enough dose, it causes death. And even water is toxic. So how can you possibly make that point? And then a quick question to Don Bosco. I think you're getting away quite easily here, because your side, you really need to explain how you think clinical trials should be conducted in India. I presume you're not saying there should never be clinical trials. So what are the rules that you want to see put in place? Otherwise, India will be held back.
The question goes for the team against the motion. Well, I'd like to ask that most of the clinical trials in India are being conducted on the poor people. So the other sections of the society will definitely benefit, but at the cost of this particular strata of the society. The poor might never be able to afford the very drug they are being tested upon. So give one strong argument to prove that the poor aren't being exploited in India.
But the question is to Don Bosco. The entire premise of your argument, which you originally began with, was that one, the consent is not correct and therefore there's exploitation. And secondly, that you've given us examples of this. Firstly, with regard to consent, it's been already established, consent forms 23 languages, you don't even know the provisions. How is it that you can say that the consent is not free then? First. Secondly, you have the question of examples. You were asked to give recent examples, but all you could come up with is something in 2003, which was 6 years ago. So explain to us how that is in any way recent as requested from you. With regard to Shankara, you stated that you can go under the RTI to ask questions, but you can't. The RTI is only for government organizations. It's not for anything else. And when you want to give an example, please don't use smallpox, because the trials for smallpox were first on cows and then on human beings. No phased trials, by the way.
Okay.
My question to Don Bosco is that you mentioned about the poor being exploited, but what about the vulnerable? Or is it that the poor and the vulnerable are the same? And my question to Sri Shankara, the second speaker, is you told that there cannot be any form of reimbursement as per the DCGI regulations. But if you are having healthy volunteers for clinical trials, they're actually given some form of reimbursement. It is only when the diseased are involved in this trial that they are not given any reimbursement or compensation package. So what's your take on that?
Biomedical research on human participants is currently going through the Indian Parliament and will ensure that all trials are reviewed by an ethics committee. Could this bill have been moved if clinical trials really did not exploit the poor?
On the question how we should go about conducting clinical trials in India, first, this is a broad answer and I'm going to explain step by step. We start with the grassroots level, where we are dealing with the people involved. The MBBS doctors, those who are involved directly with the consent letter, should make the people understand properly without neglecting the fact that some points may be missed out. Here we are talking about the duty of a doctor, which we know is unquestionable but has been questioned on grounds of negligence in the modern world. Then we come on the question of ethical committees taking their work seriously. The problem is India's ICMR is very ineffective in controlling the multinational companies which have rights from IEC. So in this context, the ethical committees must ensure that the ethical standards are maintained not only at the final and the last level of the trial, but at every stage of the trial. And then we come to the companies as a whole. The problem is in the modern world, companies are no more companies looking to help people along. They are money-hungry multinational companies. And these companies' main goal is to get the drug into the market as early as possible. I think we must get away with that, get rid of this idea and come to the fact that scientific research and development is more important than your personal goals in terms of economic advancements. And the question about the poor and vulnerable, what do we mean by them? I would like to define what poor and vulnerable really are. When we can bracket them together and say that the people who do not have the access or do not know what the Constitution provides them or cannot utilize the Constitution to protect themselves due to lack of information are poor and vulnerable. These people are guaranteed certain rights by the Constitution, but since they are not aware of it, they are unable to utilize it.
Well, for the accusation that our examples were old, recently the Supreme Court of India held up two big important biotech companies in India, the Hyderabad-based Shanta Biotech and the Bangalore-based Biocon India, for, quotes, openly conducting illegal clinical trials of new drugs on unsuspecting patients after litigation filed by the Other Destitute and Old People's Home, a Delhi-based social organization. This NGO has alleged that two companies had conducted improper clinical trials of streptokinase, a new clot-busting drug used in heart attacks. Well, these are important companies. They are giants in their respective fields. The question here is that it was illegal. If these companies can afford to go, if these companies have the morality to go for illegal trials, it is very much possible that they'll go in for unethical ones also.
When you participate in a clinical trial, the sponsors insure you. So you have insurance. The poor are insured. Even minor side effects are being insured. So they are not exploited by any chance. They are in fact benefited.
When somebody asked about reimbursement of money, well, that is not the case. That is not what I mentioned in my speech was the people who undergo clinical trials are given checkups. They are being paid for their travel. That it is given clearly stated that they are being paid for their travel if they have to go approach a certain medical organization for their clinical trial, and they're given checkups. They are not being paid any money whatsoever.
Well, it's true that clinical trials are of utmost essentiality. But what concerns us are the unethical violations and the miscarriage of clinical trials. A major problem is that a large proportion of the participants are illiterate in India and are lured into trials by offers of free healthcare and financial inducements. They are often unaware of the benefits and risks of taking part in a trial and may not even distinguish between treatment and research. The concept of informed consent, as I had earlier said, is not understood, and that's a very integral part of it. The opposition has at times confused themselves as to what is treatment and medication and clinical trials. They're completely different. As I had said, we must not rely on clinical trials for the medication and the treatment of the poor. There's absolutely no need to do that. And when we argue by saying that, on grounds of wide interests of the society by saying that yes, it is justifiable that the poor now sacrifice for the later benefit of us, I'd like to say that the wider interest actually lies in unifying both of them and achieving a total ethical approach.
Okay, what I wanted to say was, then like every system, there is a possibility that the clinical trial may not be implemented as stipulated by the law. And this is where the role of investigators come into picture. And investigators review the case and come to a conclusion as to whether violations have taken place. And moreover, if we would have thought that there should not be clinical trial, exploiting a section of society, and if we have thought so, there wouldn't have been any drugs, there wouldn't have been any medical development. And there's no stigma attached to it. It is not like the poor come for clinical trial, they volunteer to come because they can't afford for any treatment. And the higher classes, they have the choice because they can afford for it. If we should not stay back in the global markets, if we should become a developed country in all aspects, then we should appreciate the fact that clinical trials do help and put up measures to improve it rather than pointing out the disadvantages. Thank you.
I would just like to some of the controversies that have come up during this debate. First is that poor are insured. Yeah, good, they're insured. The problem is if they do not know how to gain the insurance money when something happens to them, that's a totally different question which is left unattended by the opposition. As pertaining to the ethical committees and communities, they should again take up a responsibility of not only holding up the ethics of all people, but focus on the people who are really being targeted by some multinational companies, as we have already referred as the poor and the vulnerable people. And then the thing comes is of awareness, which is of utmost importance in the modern world. If you're not aware what you have the right to do, what you don't have the right to do, or what some other people cannot do to you, you cannot protect yourself. So here again, people should be made aware even before they go for clinical trial, and not just drafted into clinical trial on pretext of any materialistic lure. Thank you.
I would just like to re-emphasize my statement saying that people who undergo trials are not paid. The insurance purely means that they are given free health checkups and their travel is paid. They are not paid any money for the trial which they underwent. And poor people are not being exploited. And it seems so that people think that clinical trials exploit vulnerable and the weak. And it is basically because ignorance of the subject. We don't even know what is going on. First of all, we should be more aware of the fact of the laws which our country is cleanly laid out, stating that any organization or any private researcher will undergo severe consequences if they cross the limits. All right. I would just like to sum it up saying that there are many diseases, many epidemics, and without clinical trials, these cannot be eradicated. And if it wasn't for clinical trials, I wouldn't be here, considering the fact that I had a viral fever last week. Thank you.
Okay, well done.